Hello and welcome to our screencast about the United States imperialism in Japan. Now, in other areas of the world, the United States practiced what's called colonial imperialism, where they attempted to take land that was not part of the United States and actually add it onto American holdings. Examples of this might be Hawaii and Alaska. In Japan, this is a little bit different. The United States really had no interest in acquiring Japan and adding it onto their holdings. Instead, they were interested in what we know as economic imperialism. They wanted to trade with Japan, and at the time, Japan was not interested in doing so. In the late 1600s, Japan became an isolationist nation, which means they opposed interaction with foreign countries. Now, no country is 100% isolationist. It's very, very difficult to do that in the modern world. However, Japan took this policy very, very seriously, and they put a number of things in effect to maintain that. For one, the government went so far as to ban the building of ocean-going vessels so that the Japanese would not be able to interact with other countries without the government's permission. They also prohibited the Japanese from leaving without permission, and if they were caught doing so and then returned to Japan, they would actually be killed as punishment. Now, Japan had a few reasons for this policy. They were very afraid of potential invasion by imperialist powers. The ruling leaders were also concerned that perhaps if they allowed trade with foreign countries to occur, other lords would become wealthy enough and powerful enough to overthrow the ruling clan. And of course, the leaders didn't want that to happen. And also, they're looking at the examples of other countries. Neighboring China, for example, was involved in the Opium Wars with Britain as a consequence of their trade with that country. So for all of these reasons, Japan tried to avoid interaction with foreign countries. The only two countries that they really had a little bit of an exception for was the Dutch and the Chinese, and they had one specific port where they allowed those two countries to send ships to and from. Now, the United States is looking at East Asia, and they have a few interests. They want to be able to trade with Japan. They're also now developing their own navy and their own trading plans, and this required refueling. If you think about going on a long trip, on a car trip with your family, you need to stop periodically for gas, you need to stop periodically to rest, to eat something, to relax. For ships going across the Pacific Ocean, this was really no different. The United States wanted coaling stations where they could stop and refuel and replenish their supplies. But at the time, other countries are starting to monopolize these potential coaling stations in the Pacific and in Asia. And the United States did not want to be shut out. There were also American ships in the area. There were trading vessels that were trading with other countries. There were whalers that were hunting for whale in that area. And occasionally storms would approach, ships would sink, sailors would wash up on Japanese soil, and they wouldn't be helped by the Japanese government. They weren't treated well. They were not welcome. And finally, the United States historically had that idea of manifest destiny, that it was their destiny to expand and spread throughout the world. Now, in early American history, that meant throughout the continental United States. Once the U.S. reached California and the Pacific, they started turning their eyes outward and to other places as well. And they had that idea of their civilization being the best one, their way of doing things being the best way. And they believed that they had an obligation to the rest of the world that was maybe backwards or behind to teach them the error of their ways and show them the better way of doing things. So in 1852, the United States president was Millard Fillmore, and he was one of the early proponents of opening up trade with Japan. And he wanted to send an emissary to Japan to suggest this arrangement between the two nations and negotiate on his behalf. Now, he wanted to send someone that was going to be serious, was going to be respected, and would be able to get the job done. So he obviously couldn't pick someone like Gilligan or the skipper that are incompetent and would be unable to accomplish this mission. He can't pick anyone like SpongeBob because obviously although nautical and in the ocean, these guys cannot be taken seriously either. So in pondering who he was going to send on the United States' behalf, he ends up choosing a man named Matthew Perry. Now, Matthew Perry, not to be confused with this Matthew Perry from Friends, Commodore Matthew Perry was a very serious naval leader. He had served in a number of American wars, such as the Mexican-American War, and prior to that, the War of 1812. And he was very respected, and Fillmore knew that he would be taken very seriously. So he gave Perry some directions to go to Japan, to share a letter that he had written with the Japanese leader, and to use gunboat diplomacy if needed, meaning he should be comfortable using the threat of force to accomplish President Fillmore's goals. So in 1853, Perry reaches Japan. Originally, the Japanese weren't even going to allow him to interact with the Japanese people. He's sort of rejected right up front. And he ends up threatening the Japanese people with burning down their capital city. He also takes his big guns and shoots them, not at the people, but to intimidate them. And they eventually allow him to deliver these letters. And despite that, he is rejected. They say, no, we're not interested in trading with you. Thanks, but no thanks. Now, if you've ever seen a movie where a man proposes marriage to a girl and she says no, you might see them say something like, well, don't answer right now. Let me give you some time to think about it. And don't decide too quickly. I'll come back. I'll give you another chance. And that's what Perry does in this instance. He tells the Japanese people, I'm not ready to accept this answer. I'm going to leave. I'll come back in a year or so, give you some time to think it over. And hopefully when I come back, you'll have reconsidered and have made a better decision. This is an illustration or an image of Perry's, one of the ships that Perry brought with him on his first trip there. He took about 4 ships with him at that time. This is how the Japanese portrayed Perry's ship in their artwork. If you take a quick look here, you can see that obviously it's not an accurate portrayal, but they portray it this way for a reason. Again, here's our image of Commodore Matthew Perry, and this is how he is portrayed in Japanese art. Again, clearly not an accurate representation. But when you consider these 2 illustrations, they're very telling, and they do point out to us or give us a sense of how the Japanese perceived Perry and the United States. They clearly look villainous in these illustrations. If we were to look at these illustrations in a children's book, even without reading the text of the story, we would assume that these were the bad guys, that this man and his accomplices were the ones that were in the wrong and were out to do harm to the main character in our story here, the Japanese people. Perry does return about 6 months later. He did not give them the full year that they were expecting, and he demands another answer. When he arrives the second time, he comes with about 10 ships this time. So again, this is going to look very intimidating to the Japanese people, especially considering, as I said before, they did not have any navy to speak of. They weren't allowed to even build ships that could compete with the size of these naval ships. And when the Japanese see that and they see all these ships out in the harbor, they are very intimidated, as was Perry's intention. And they recognize that they really had no choice here. If they decided to reject Perry once again, he would be very capable of simply turning those big guns on to the Japanese mainland and doing some serious damage, and potentially taking them over, or they didn't know what would happen and they didn't want to risk that. So what they decide to do is they give in to his demands. They sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. There are 12 articles in that treaty, but 3 of the most important ones are listed here. So first and foremost, Japan agrees to open trade with the United States, which was Fillmore's original goal. Japan also agrees to begin helping shipwrecked sailors. So naval ships, whaling vessels, merchant ships, if there were to be a storm and they would need assistance, now they know that they can go to Japan and expect that assistance to be forthcoming. And finally, Japan opens a consulate for the United States in Japan, and this is a good example of what's going to happen as we're going forward, that they're going to open some diplomatic relationship between these two countries. Now, interestingly, an unintended consequence of the Treaty of Kanagawa and Japan opening up trade with the United States is that they begin to industrialize. They were so far behind for the last couple of 100 years because they hadn't been getting new ideas and new technology from the rest of the world, that now that the United States has forced them to do that, they're going to catch up pretty quickly. And over the next 100 years or so, they're going to industrialize to such a degree that in 1941, they are going to be able to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor and do a great amount of damage to the American Navy there, which will propel the United States to participate in World War II and have to fight against Japan as an enemy. So this is just an interesting thing to think about, that we don't always get the outcome that we're expecting when we make large decisions like this. So I hope you enjoyed today's screencast on American economic imperialism in Japan. Thank you.